In October of 987, the general Bardus Phocas the Younger began his revolt against the Byzantine Emperor Basil II. Tensions came to a head after the emperor tightened his grip on the military aristocracy, in which the Phocas family had long been entrenched. Phocas declared himself emperor, collecting support among various disgruntled nobles and soldiers who feared Basil's centralization of power. Phocas conscripted an army of giant Iberian warriors, and Basil was aided by 6,000 Varangians from Kiev. Outside the town of Abydos, the battle lines of the two armies drew close, and when Phocas learned the emperor and his brother were in the opposing army, Phocas decided the day had come to fight for the future of the empire. But in Phocas's retinue were a number of astrologers, who advised against the fighting. Quote, "Their sacrifices clearly showed the folly of it, but he gave rein to his horse and obstinately refused to listen. It is said that the signs of ill omen appeared to him, as well as to the astrologers, for no sooner had he mounted his horse than the charger slipped under him. After falling off his first horse, and then a second, Phocas mounted a third, for he was not a man to give up once he'd made his mind. And so, riding at the head of his army, with Iberian ground troops around him, he charged towards the emperor's ranks, indeed to the emperor himself, roaring with his sword hoisted as if to slay Basil single-handedly. The emperor came out to the front of his army, sword in hand, clasping an image of the Virgin Mary in his left. He watched on stoically as Phocas's army swept over the plain like a black wind. Javelins began to rain down from the flanks, and just as Basil's brother Constantine rode up with a long spear leveled at the enemy, Phocas rode out ahead of his army and yet again slipped from his horse. Accounts differ as to what happened next, whether Phocas was slain by a javelin, or if the Virgin Mary's icon on the field had wrought some manner of divine justice. But the most accepted version has it that Phocas succumbed to a devious intrigue and had been poisoned by his cupbearer through the plans of Emperor Basil himself. In any event, when Phocas's armies saw their leader collapse, most abandoned the cause, and Basil's troops charged into the chaos, scattering the Iberian bodyguards. And so Phocas's head was severed and laid at Basil's feet. From then on, it is said that Basil was forever changed, becoming suspicious and grieved, and easy to rage when his orders were not carried out in the greatest haste. For whatever it was worth, if Phocas would have but listened to the advice of his astrologers, perhaps his rebellion would have lived on to fight another day, or perhaps the sad state of Basil II would have never began. This Byzantine anecdote is but one of many episodes in history where failing to heed the advice of astrologers breeds fatal consequence. But as we will see, there were no shortage of mixed results and mysteries when it came to making state decisions influenced by the ancient practice of astrology. The oldest known evidence for astrology as a basis for using the position of celestial bodies to determine the fate of people, events, or the outcomes of military campaigns is found in ancient Mesopotamia in the early 2nd millennia BC, and with the Decans system of the ancient Egyptians. The earliest known astrological texts include the Enuma Anu Enlil, which contains omens of weather and the fate of kings based on the appearance and movements of celestial bodies, and the Egyptian Book of Nut, which contained guidelines of rituals and festivals based on celestial appearances. Astrology was but one of many forms of ancient divination. Other methods of seeking knowledge of the future by hidden means included augury, the practice of interpreting bird signs, extispicy, the practice of reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, dream interpretation, and the casting of lots, among others. Versions of astrology existed in the Hindu tradition at least as far back as 1200 BC, with the Vedanta Jyotisha, and later in the Hellenic world, where astrology developed into a fatalistic and prophetic art. The earliest known personal horoscope is probably from the city of Uruk in the 5th century BC. The history of astrological development is a complex and wide-ranging study with many variations. Astrology as a modern practice is rife with disagreement, pride, arrogance, and outright fraud. Despite many claiming to possess some ancient system more correct than the alternatives, astrology has ultimately failed to regain critical appeal, and its abundance of superficial practitioners rarely have good answers to the hard questions. Modern astrologers, in the rare event that they agree on their methods, often fail to reconcile free will into the alleged influence of celestial bodies on human destiny. As we will see, however, the role of free will usually has its place as a priority within the ancient systems. It is not the place of this essay to determine each of the flaws of astrology as we know it, or to exhaustively detail their different incarnations, but to point to its place in various disjointed episodes of history. At the very least, we sense that there is something to the practice, considering its long-standing ability to captivate intellects and, at times, make accurate predictions. Throughout the development of greater and lesser civilizations in one form or the next, astrology found its influence. In some places, astrologers were common in the courts of emperors and kings. In others, they were relegated to a shamanic corner, or operated toe-in-toe with the decision-making process of a given state or military campaign. Whether or not we believe in astrology as a viable practice, at least in some small part, many ancient peoples regarded it as a divinatory science. In one place, it is indispensable. In others, it is a laughable scam with some residue of a lost art, and its practitioners were at risk of abrupt persecution. Now let us weave our way through history, musing over the interplay of astrology, warfare, and politics. There are several instances where astrologers found themselves in lose-lose situations, under mortal peril based on either the alleged failure of their readings or the results of the readings being unfavorable to their recipients. One prominent astrologer who wrote extensively on the subject was the 13th century Italian Guido Bonatti, who wrote the Book of Astronomy, which later showed up in the libraries of Ficino and John Dee. In the text, Bonatti distinguished the astrological art from that of the physicians, for where the physicians study only the mundane bodies, the astrologer studies the supercelestial bodies which influence the mundane. In fact, the stars themselves make imprints on inferior bodies, impressions which govern their mutations. Bonatti leverages the plainly seen changes of the seasons to support his stance. For here it is obvious that the movements of celestial bodies manifest in the leaves and fruits of trees or the lack thereof. Quote, concerning this science, it is certain that we are able to know not only the understanding of present things, but also the recollection of things having already occurred, and the foreseeing of the future, both for the individual and for the two parts of the universe. Bonatti regarded the subject of astrology as, quote, the quality of motion of the supercelestial bodies. An astrologer is one who knows these and the kind of impressions they make on the earth and the elements, regarding those who doubt the significance of these impressions as idiots or fools, reasoning that, quote, everything which happens at the present time, and which has happened thus far, and which will happen in the future, can be known by the astrologer, since he knows the qualities of motion which were, which are, and afterwards will be, in which times they will be, and what happens from these effects. Although we lack examples of Bonatti giving military advice through astrological knowledge, he is thought to have served in this capacity for Count Guido Montefeltro, and does reference some general readings he made to inquirers. To understand his systematic methodology exhausted over 350 pages of work would require an advanced course in the astronomy and astrology of his time. This suffices to say that wherever the practice found itself, it could be difficult to grasp, even among the theologians and intellectuals. The esoteric nature of the practice led to not only the scarcity of its practitioners, but rife disagreements between them. Astrology's obscurity made it both unquestionable to the gullible and the subject of utter derision among critics. As it happened, Bonatti was depicted in Dante's Inferno as residing in hell with other figures who thought they could predict the future. If we fast forward to the 17th century, we find the English astrologer William Lilly taking up the daunting task of putting the entire scope of his astrological knowledge into the text Christian Astrology, written in 1647. This work would become a classic tome of medieval astrology and showcases something of William Lilly's genius. It could be argued very few ever elevated the art of astrology to a science so much as William Lilly. He was friends with the great Hermetic philosopher, Freemason, and alchemist Elias Ashmole. Lilly, just as well as Ashmole and Bonatti, credits the writings of Hermes Trismegistus as a primary source for his knowledge, even attempting to reproduce certain lesser-known astrological hermetica in English. In Christian astrology, Lilly gives examples of his military advisements. He recounts when he gave a reading in favor of the Earl of Essex taking the town of Reading with his troops during the English Civil War. This was ultimately successful, and Lilly says, quote, "The town was delivered for the Parliament's use on the 27th of April, 1644, 3 days after the time limited by me was expired. But it's observable, the very Monday before, being 8 days after the figure set, they began to treat." When asked if King Charles I should procure Irish soldiers to harm the Parliament, Lilly judged that while the Irish would improve his forces for a time, they should not stay long. And when they did stay too long, the presence of the Irish hardened the hearts of British soldiers against them. Once a certain ingenious and serious alchemist inquired with Lilly as to whether or not he would achieve the philosopher's stone, a certain perfected state in alchemy, which allows one to turn base metals into gold. But more than being limited to this physical accomplishment, the philosopher's stone applies also to the transmutation of what is base in ourselves into spiritual gold. While Lilly admits that he believes such a power exists, he did not see it in the cards for the inquirer's future. Quote, "I judged the querent had formerly spent some time in search of this admirable jewel, the elixir, but in vain and to no purpose. I advised the querent to decline his further progress upon that subject, and in regard of the former reasons, advertised him how incapable he was, and the improbability of the thing he intended." Few episodes in the history of astrological advisors have gained as much attention as the reign of Tiberius Caesar, beginning in 14 AD, following the death of his adoptive father, Octavian. While Tiberius's mother was pregnant with him, during a time the rule of Caesars in Rome was still unknown, a certain astrologer Scribonius predicted, quote, "He will come in time to be even a king, but without the usual badge of royal dignity." Many omens, divine signs, and oracular predictions are associated with Tiberius's career. One astrologer in particular was brought into his family, but not without great risk of his life. For as Suetonius, a Roman biographer, says, Tiberius, quote, "then likewise had a remarkable proof of the skill of Thrasyllus, the astrologer, whom, for his proficiency in philosophical researches, he had taken into his family. For upon sight of the ship which brought the intelligence, he said, whereas everything going wrong before, and quite contrary to his predictions, Tiberius had intended, that very moment, when they were walking together, to throw him into the sea, as an impostor, and one to whom he had too hastily entrusted his secrets." But the more famous story of Tiberius's test of his astrologer comes from Tacitus, where we read of Tiberius resolving to investigate his astrologer's accuracy. Tiberius begins to bring Thrasyllus towards a cliff's edge, and asks the astrologer if he had ascertained his own horoscope, particularly for the prediction of the rest of the year. And so Thrasyllus draws his diagrams and casts his horoscope and freezes, essentially saying, "I'm afraid my life is in danger, but I know not from what or whom." Tiberius embraces him then, and lets him live. For if Thrasyllus had failed to predict his doom, then Tiberius would know he was a fraud, and he would have thrown him from the cliff top then and there. The recorder of this narrative himself pauses to engage the mystery of these tales. Tacitus writes, "For myself, when I listen to this and similar narratives, my judgment wavers. Is the revolution of human things governed by fate and changeless necessity, or by accident? You will find the wisest of the ancients and the disciplines attached to their tenets at complete variance. In many of them a fixed belief that heaven concerns itself neither with our origins, nor with our ending, nor, in fine, with mankind, and that so adversity continually assails the good, while prosperity dwells among the evil. Others hold, on the contrary, that, though there is certainty of fate in harmony with events, it does not emanate from wandering stars, but must be sought in the principles and processes of natural causation. Still, they leave us free to choose our life. That choice made, however, the order of the future is certain." Here we see the early recognition of many different forms of astrological divination among the ancients, the alleged quagmire of fate and free will, and whether or not the gods or the stars should properly be seen to govern or affect human affairs with such detail. In the field of divination, one may find that these mysteries are still unresolved. On one hand, we cannot throw out every prediction or prophecy that turned out to come true, and on the other, we cannot accept all prophecies on their face, and must grab the reins of our own destiny no matter what omens are said to stand in our way. Romantic stories about the birth and death of Alexander the Great were also spun up without much in the way of trusted sources. The Alexandrian romance, for instance, relays the story of a certain Nectanebus, the last native pharaoh of Egypt, who ruled around 318 BC. The legend goes that the king's skill as a magician and wise man was unparalleled. His astrology, precognition, and fortune-telling were second to none. It is said that when Egypt was invaded by enemies, land or sea, Nectanebus would retire to a private chamber, and with wax figures of his enemies and figures of his own armies, he would take up an ebony rod and a prophet's cloak, and uttering words of power, the wax figures would flutter and fight, and the very real ships of his enemies would sink to the bottom of the sea. This power, however, would not suffice, as the story goes, to prevent his land of Egypt from ultimately falling to a league of nations who would come to follow one Alexander the Great into conquest. When Nectanebus foresaw this, the unbelievable story goes that he disguised himself and sailed off to Macedonia, where he influenced the very birth of Alexander, causing him to be seen as a son of the god Ammon by influencing the dreams of Alexander's mother and father prior to the child's birth. Even in legitimate history, when Alexander and his armies came into Egypt, they were regarded as liberators, and an oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis pronounced him master of the universe and a descendant of Ammon. Of Alexander's death, Plutarch records a tale of Babylonian priests, renowned for their astrological science, predicting that Alexander's entrance into Babylon would lead to his death. Disregarding these omens, not long after Alexander entered the city in 323 BC, he died by way of an illness or some other unknown cause. In another place, the Indian sage Calanus, on his deathbed, is said to have told Alexander personally that they would meet again soon in Babylon. This can be interpreted to have meant Calanus was predicting Alexander's approaching death at the city. Nearly 1,000 years later, Cecco d'Ascoli, the Italian professor of astrology at the University of Bologna, was welcoming great controversy for his repeated publications and seemingly heretical overreaches in the astrological art. At one point, Cecco was fined for writing a commentary on Sacrobosco's De Sfera Mundi, which suggested certain demonic influences among the stars. Cecco called in further accusations of heresy when he wrote an encyclopedia containing much astrology and natural philosophy. These repeated encroachments on the religious dogmatists of the time resulted in Cecco's execution in Florence, where the man was burned alive. Another astrologer, the German mathematician and astronomer Johannes Stoffler, forecasted in 1499 that the world would be rocked by a deluge on February 20th of 1524, apparently based on a rare alignment of planets in Pisces. This prediction spread across Europe to the dismay of many, even prompting the German Count von Igelheim to build a 3-story ark on the Rhine River in preparation. But when February the 20th rolled around, and only a light rain afflicted the region, the Count was stoned to death by a mob. And despite Stoffler's attempted correction of his flood prediction, pushing it back a number of years, he was not taken seriously, and the second prediction yielded no results. Recognition of the futility of astrology is present in the Old Testament as well, creating some level of a precedent for later literalists to use against astrology. In Isaiah 47, Isaiah is depicted as mocking astrologers and the Babylonians who buy into their divinatory schemes, while at the same time prophesying the destruction of Babylon. Keep on, then, with your magic spells and your many sorceries, which you have labored at since childhood. Perhaps you will succeed, perhaps you will cause terror. All the counsel you have received has only worn you out. Let your astrologers come forward, those stargazers who make predictions month by month. Let them save you from what is coming upon you. Surely they are like stubble, the fire will burn them up. They cannot even save themselves from the power of the flame. These are not coals for warmth, this is not a fire to sit by. The narrative in the book of Daniel of King Nebuchadnezzar also becomes a tool used against astrology. The king asks his astrologers to interpret a stressful dream without telling them of the dream itself, threatening execution when they failed to do so, whereas Daniel, through the power of God alone, offered the king what was seen as the true meaning of the dream, performing what the astrologers could not. However much these and other biblical stories paint astrology in a negative light, the story of the 3 wise magi in Matthew, who follow a star to Bethlehem in pursuit of the newborn king of the Jews, is often interpreted as an esoteric nod to the predictive powers of astrologers and star worshippers from the East. Nevertheless, this star they follow is depicted not merely as rising naturally into the night sky, but going ahead of them and coming to a stop above the location of the newborn Jesus. Is this then indicative of an astrological layer to the story, or perhaps that of the angelic? Weaving back into the future, we stitch next into the time of the 30 Years' War, the brutal conflict between Catholic and Protestant states fought mostly in Central Europe. In the 1620s, the German astronomer Johannes Kepler was tapped by the military leader Albrecht von Wallenstein for astrological advice regarding his military affairs. Kepler is often regarded as the last astronomer who also practiced astrology. Despite Kepler's skepticism of traditional astrology, he echoed the standard and now modern idea of horoscopy, or the celestial impressions at the moment of birth. Quote, "The soul of the newly born baby is marked for life by the patterns of the stars at the moment it comes into the world, unconsciously remembers it, and remains sensitive to the return of configurations of a similar kind." The creativity regarding the use of astrologers during wartime finds a new incarnation in World War II, when the Swiss astrologer and mystic Karl Ernst Krafft was invited into Germany by the Nazis and endorsed by the Ministry of Propaganda. In early November of 1939, Krafft wrote a letter to Dr. Heinrich Fessel, warning that there would be an assassination attempt on Hitler's life between November the 7th and 10th. When on November 8th a bomb exploded in Berger Brockeler in Munich and missed Hitler only by a few minutes, the Gestapo arrested Krafft and later employed him to use astrology for analyses and propaganda. This kind of Nazi occultism led to the British Intelligence Political Warfare Executive Office to employ the Hungarian-born astrologer Louis de Wohl to produce counter-propaganda in the form of astrological predictions. Due to Heinrich Himmler and other top Nazi officials' serious interest in occult practices, British intelligence and MI5 saw this as a vulnerability, with some chance for exploitation. In all these episodes, we can't imagine all commanders or kings with astrologers on their panel taking advice solely from the astrologers. In most cases, at least outside of Babylon, a given ruler or commander also relies on every other kind of tool to inform their decisions, namely past experience, objective numbers, the morale of the army, the time of day, strategic advantage, and so on. Seeing the world with the added tool of astrology gives way to a range of connections. There are, after all, times of the day when we feel better than others, times in our lives where we feel in season. If we are readily moved by persuasion of the style often displayed by ancient or recent astrologers, it is not difficult to see how we might be moved by their advisement, especially if there are records of their predictions coming true in the past. The idea of a predictive knowledge of astrology, however, also acts on the beliefs of the astrologer. If, therefore, an astrologer reads or is told to read negative outcomes into a given situation, we then incur a negative result, based on nothing but an assumed knowledge of astrology. Per any belief system, when the negative outlook takes hold, we should become intensely skeptical. Because if we allowed some astrological advice to change our perception from positive to negative, we have then, by definition, altered the course of the immediate future, based on the change in our state of being. Those of us with heightened self-awareness are rarely receptive to astrological advice that strays too far outside the practical. And when an astrologer gives us a reading that merely confirms what we already know about ourselves, we can choose to simply point out that this perspective is already obvious, or that the astrological reading is unnecessary, for it offers nothing more than what is currently known. However, if the astrologer knows nothing about us and yet makes accurate predictions or readings of our past, we find it difficult to shrug off the entire practice as a foolish falsehood for the weak of heart. An astrologer who may also be a charlatan will look like a genius by making a probable read on a given outcome when it comes true. Nonetheless, it is among the weakest of the esoteric arts, in that whenever we want to apply it, we do. Whenever we don't, we believe whatever else we need to move on. Belief being the common denominator. The value of astrology may lie solely in its ability to shift our belief system toward a more positive state of being, which means that it is merely a tool by which one may change their perception. The other best-case scenario for astrology lies in discovering measurable psychological effects of the invisible frequencies, such as electromagnetic waves, overlaid on our reality by the planets alone. The sun and moon offer the most obvious chance for astrologers to claim any scientific ground, seeing as the moon, for one, plays a role in menstrual cycles, sleep patterns, animal behavior, which by all means have lasting effects on human behavior and psychology. The most charitable perspective of astrology is one that reinforces our humility in the face of infinite celestial unknowns. It would only hold with the most closed-minded opinions to assert that we have at the current time discovered all there is to know about the invisible forces of the cosmos that influence us. Simply because we cannot measure all of the effects of celestial bodies on our psychology, behavior, and health, does not mean that such effects are not present. Astrology, especially that of the ancients, may just as well possess a fragmented form of a more complete and ancient wisdom. In the event that humanity was once more sensitive to the discrete energies of the planets, we should deem it possible to return to that state of sensitivity. This is the kind of sensitivity that would have aided the far-reaching, intricate calendar systems of Mesoamerica among the Olmecs, Maya, and Aztecs. These peoples used their calendars also to govern their rituals, feasts, and holidays, much as the Egyptians. Cycles in the stars had immediate effects in the events on Earth, and there were good reasons to pay homage to the gods on different days of the year. The 16th century Florentine Codex, written by the Spanish Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun with the aid of Nahua native elders, details the astrological beliefs among the Aztecs. This being but one example of how so-called mundane astrology and horary astrology was as universal a practice as many of the other forms of divination. This friar, for one, has little reason, as you will see, to create falsehoods regarding Aztec astrology, seeing as the friar is given to view these practices as workings of the devil. Bernardino writes in Book 4 of the Florentine Codex, quote, "It is very well known that the astrologers, called genethliaci, are interested in knowing the hour and moment of each person's birth, and once they know it, they divine and predict men's natural inclinations by studying the sign under which they are born, and the state and appearance that the planets had at that point among themselves with respect to the sign. These astrologers or fortune-tellers base their divination on the influence of the constellations and planets, and because of this their divination is tolerated and allowed in the lists that the common people use, under the condition that nobody should think that a constellation's influence does anything else but incline one toward sensuality, and that it does not have any power over free will." These natives of all New Spain had and still have great interest in knowing the day and hour of each person's birth in order to divine the qualities, life, and death of those who were born. Those who had this occupation were called Tonalpoque, and they, the native people, would approach them as if prophets any time a son or daughter was born to them, in order to inform themselves about their qualities, life, and death. These fortune-tellers were ruled not by the signs or the planets of the sky, but by a teaching that, according to them, Quetzalcoatl left to them, which contains 20 characters multiplied 13 times, according to the manner contained in this present book. This counting method is either a necromantic art or a pact and ruse of the devil, so it must be uprooted with all due diligence. Whatever true science of astrology there has been and still is, it may be a long time before it returns as a serious consideration in the Western world. I view it cautiously as an unreliable permission slip, both mysteriously reported to predict outcomes and events. The identity crisis now plaguing the Western mind can do nothing but shrug at the idea of finding direct answers about life in the conjunctions of stars and celestial bodies. To look too far outside for our purpose, we risk becoming unknown to ourselves. Now, it can be argued, is far more the time for honing the power of will, the acute sensitivity to synchronicity and providence, and the emphasis on the imagination and its powers to solve immediate problems and reconnect us to the higher divine mind and the tranquil peace found in the quiet beauty of nature. Thank you for watching this brief look at astrology's role in world history. Please like and subscribe and consider supporting my work through the links below in the description. There's much more to come. Thank you.